September 14, 2022, 9:11 a.m. Chapter 4. Here we discuss Article 1, Section 6 of the Tennessee State Constitution, where trial by jury is ensured.
Trial by jury assured. Rutherford County is located in Middle Tennessee, bordering Davidson County to the north. The county is named after Griffith Rutherford, 1721 to 1805, who immigrated to the colonies from Ireland at 18. A member of the Colonial Militia from 1760 to 1775, promoted from captain to colonel in 1772, he would become colonel in the North Carolina Militia, being promoted to brigadier general in 1776. He was taken prisoner at the Battle of Camden in 1780, and after his exchange in 1781, he fought on mainly against the Cherokee, but why? Well, many Cherokee had over the years learned and mastered both English and French in the Tennessee Valley from the two as trade increased. Native Americans were no fools, pitting the French against the English and the Crown against the colonists, whenever they felt it necessary. Some natives were catered to more by the French and others by the English. Surely, those who Rutherford fought were more of the English persuasion, because the Irish resembled the bottom of the totem pole up the evolutionary ladder of society for the English. The Irish potato famine would send them flocking to the new country as needy and hungry as the lowest of slaves, and comparing the worst of them to the best of those of African persuasion was something the Royal Assembly of Greater Men of Rutherford County wouldn't allow. Richard Zebulun Rutherford couldn't resist the defense of slaves against the prosecution of the Irish, who saw no better way of upward mobility than from the suppression of those of African persuasion.
Richard Zebulun Rutherford, better known as the defendant, was one of African persuasion who took on all challengers, several of whom happened to be Irish. The younger of those Irish found sport in challenging the greater men, because they felt they deserved to win over them all, but it was just not as simple as fighting the first one they saw. There was a labyrinth of fighters on the circuit before one could fight for the title, but the endless stream of Irish fighting to prove themselves superior to blacks and thus more equal to whites kept the Royal Assembly of Greater Men of Rutherford County in defense of what was to them a birthright. The winner of the contests also were afforded breeding rights, so if an Irishman won, usually a mulatto child would arrive 9 months later, which is why the stars had to be aligned so that these babies would be born around a certain time of year and one day inducted into the Royal Assembly. Most Irish were Catholic, but outside and away from the church's sphere of influence, they seemed to be more savage than the most uncivilized native, so it wasn't easy to defeat them. The defendant was prosecuted for one such fights where he defeated an Irishman whose pride drove his belief that he would win at any cost and in any way. So, the bruised and beaten Irishman sought to report his loss to another who didn't see it as just a fight but a battle between black and white. The politics surrounding the Royal Assembly wouldn't afford whites suppression of them, as they may have other less connected blacks, but why?
Richard Zebulun Rutherford was by profession a haberdasher, and he, as others in his profession, discriminated against others who were not as fashionably presentable. He dressed many whites, several blacks, few Irish, and most of the Royal Assembly of Greater Men in Rutherford County. See, slaves had a hierarchy where one could tell another's status by his attire, and being literate they knew how to educate and prepare slaves for professions to their preference, so that in private sale slaves would find more amicable homes. Auction blocks were reserved for slaves who wouldn't cooperate or owners who needed money. Greater men were legally owned by their masters, but they were all fortunate enough to be economically stable. As the presentation of one slaves was a representation of their owners, not all slaves were cotton pickers. The institution of slavery allowed for the formation of the Royal Assembly and maintained the knowledge of its existence as a force to appease as opposed to reckon with.
But the charges against the defendant created a tremendous stir amongst whites in Rutherford and surrounding counties, too great to be overlooked. The defendant was so clean and polished that the envy of whites drove their conviction to soil the name of this scholar, gentleman, slave, and greater man, but he knew it would. A trial by jury for a slave was not heard of, but it was considered for the defendant. He felt the best option for defense would be to tone down his appearance to look more like an average slave than the splendid role model he was. He could sound humble enough to pass for an average slave, but he didn't have any clothes to make him look as such. So, he did something he hadn't had to do since aspiring to be of the greater men: borrow some clothes. Not just any clothes, but the older the better, and the dirtier even more so. When the angry mob of jurors approached to escort Rutherford to the courthouse, they were so disappointed in what they saw until they put down their pitchforks and rifles, dispersing for home.
As all in the Royal Assembly were first trained to govern by the family structure afforded, they fell in line with society from the profession in which they were most interested. The defendant saw too much shame in degrading himself and his profession by wearing the ragged clothes, but he knew that for the sake of the county and all the innocent people who may be hurt by a rebellion by the Grand Consistory, he couldn't. Proving to be the better man, he disguised himself like Odysseus did the Cyclops and escaped a prosecution that would damn him and bring the Royal Assembly to arms against a white population that saw all prominent blacks as a threat. Being from the line of Rutherfords, the defendant's trial may have gone in his favor at the courthouse, but the cost if he won would cause the Royal Assembly to be pursued, and if lost, martyrdom and an assured call to arms. So, either way, loss was guaranteed.
After questions we will have pop quiz 1. You're dismissed once you turn yours in. We will see you back here next Wednesday at the same place and time.